Are we starting then?
We are starting. Sorry, I had done that thing where I mute myself twice and I'd only taken myself off mute once.
I was too busy dancing to notice.
Amateur. Yeah, sorry about the music. We don't have any yet, but next week I may bring my flute and entertain you with the tuneful sound of green sleeves. That's a joke. So, welcome to the stream. This week, what are we talking about? We are talking about mini games. We do have some resources. Andy Law, tell me when you would like me to add them into the stream.
I will. How very exciting.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll do that
Excellent.
later.
But before we get to those handouts, we shall have a quick chat about what are mini games. Yeah, and then we've got a few other questions I'm going to ask you all.
Okay, I'm ready to start this one if you want.
Are you? Excellent. I've been thinking about it. Let me throw something at you and see what you
you'll ruin my spiel. I've got a whole spiel prepared.
Fine. Go for it then.
Okay, let's see if it covers what you were going to say. So I'm going to start my definition of what are mini games right from the very beginning of where the term was most commonly used, and that's with computer games. And with computer games, a mini game is generally defined as a self-contained game within a game. And that's a nice starting point. It's a game within a game. So, for example, you might have an in-game card game, like Gwent in The Witcher. It looks like Graham's vanished. Bye, Graham. An in-game card, like Gwenty cards. And a mini game would be playing that game for real inside your role-playing game. Now, that has strengths and weaknesses in terms of actual utility at your table, but that is one version of a mini game. Hello again, Graham. Other versions, you've missed my little spiel about what a minigame is, but I'm going off anyway. There are many other ways you can use minigames in role-playing games, though, at the tabletop, because our tabletop already has a predefined set of rules for whichever game that you're particularly playing. But if your climax, for example, had a gigantic battle, where we're talking about thousands of troops swarming down hillsides, and you've got a set of rules that are designed to have a single character face off, preferably at most 1 to maybe 5 other individuals, not 250, then you're potentially in trouble. You often have to look to another game to try and fulfill the hole in the rules in the game you're playing at hand, or you create something and add it on top. Now, typically the way I deal with it is I create a mini game. I create another game to deal with all of that so we can keep the focus on the players while the bigger stuff is handled off towards the side. Now, in my campaigns, that's referred to as a mini game. Your campaigns may be different. Oh, looks like Graham's having fun.
Yeah, Graham's having audio problems, so we'll see how he goes.
Okay, good luck, Graham. Oh, I can just hear you there, yes.
You're extremely faint.
The last definition for me with mini games is small situations that you want to deal with that your rules, just don't have methods of coping with. Now, this might not be a gigantic battle. This could be, to give a single situation, in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, I wrote a mini game directly into the mechanics after looking at the mechanics as they stood near the end, and that was for bribery. If you look at the bribery rules, they've got a little mini game where you can get a number of successes, and that will transfer to making a guessing game as to how much money you need to give to the person to bribe using your skill at hand regarding the individuals that you might be bribing. Now, that's a mini game that's not strictly speaking a mini game because the game itself provides those rules, but it's an example of what I would have done if it was my own campaign and looked at the rules. I'd have looked at it and said, I want to make that a bit more interesting. I'll add my own little mini game on top of the existing rules. So there's my loose definition to get everyone going in on, and then everyone else can run off with their own.
So I did think of, I definitely thought of video games first, and that's where I jumped off from, because I've mentioned on the streams before, I do love a mini game, Chocobo Racing, Blitzball, Gwenty cards. Yeah, I'm a big fan of a mini game. So I was thinking, mini games are often in an RPG something outside of the mechanics, the undefined or undeveloped in the main rule set. And if that's the case, we use them to drive forward the narrative in a more satisfying way. So say you have something that's in an adventure that you could resolve with, I don't know, some kind of leadership role and some kind of generic combat role. So the minigame replaces those 1 or 2 individual roles with a solution that gives the player more agency and more complexity. So that for me would be a key thing that you missed about the narrative. And when mini games are written in the rules by the developers, I often find that they're then the reverse. They're actually often a diversion from the narrative. Like barge trading, you don't need that to drive the narrative story forward. Or they're developments that give you the option to do more creative things, to make spells, to do, to create things yourself. So that was my thoughts on minigames.
Yeah, and that very much fits what I was thinking when I was trying to figure out how I would define it as well. In that I kind of would have two broad categories of like sort of integrated and incidental. So like the ones you're talking about where it's very much driving forward the narrative, like those are integrated into the story you're telling, whereas the sort of the pub games and things like that are more kind of incidental. That's not to say that they can add something to the storytelling and deepen connections between characters that will pay off later, but they're not fundamental to driving the story forward. So yeah, good. We are all unsurprisingly aligned.
Graham, has your sound? Yeah, Graham might come out of. Oh no!
Oh no! We can't hear you there.
Hang on. Try. It's not letting me unmute you, Graham.
I heard something there.
I just unmuted myself.
Excellent.
So yeah,
Hooray.
Yeah. No, it turns out I had two sets of headphones plugged into different ports, and they were interfering with each other. So anyway, yes, mini games. They can, as you say, drive things forward. They can be incidental. I was interested in what you said, Lindsay, about adding a little bit more complexity to a situation, looking at it in more depth. Because I once designed a mini game that did exactly the opposite. It simplified something. And that was in the old Warhammer adventure, Something Rotten in Kislev. There's a point where the adventurers are being chased across the endless steppes of Kislev by a horde of Dolgan barbarians. And there was no way in the rules for me to figure out how to resolve this. So I just designed a little chase game with there was a little board and a marker, and they got closer or they got further away, depending on what happened to you with your ride rolls. And so sometimes, yeah, that can be a way to get around something that the rules doesn't support.
Like chase scenes are quite common, although we did add a quick set of chase scene rules into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4.
Right.
Again, to provide that little bit of mini game, the mechanics will be quite slow if we do it on a turn by turn by turn basis.
Exactly.
Because everyone runs forward a bit, then everyone else runs forward a bit, and that doesn't quite work for a chase.
No.
And replicating that in a slightly different way was hard coded into the rules to give an example of how those rules could be adapted and possibly added in different ways for future supplements. But if everyone's done their thing, I can throw up a few pictures to give an idea of some of the craziness that we've done for mini games at this end. So,
are you ready to go?
Yeah, just throw up whatever we got. Okay, so we've got a couple of mini games here now. One of them is the most obvious one. If you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you can very easily play Warhammer Fantasy Battle and grab yourself a game of that to represent something that's going on the larger scale while the PCs are doing something else. Now, just as quick notes on this, the impact that this can have is if you've got lots of players who enjoy this, it's loads of fun. Because they get to play a different game and it can break up the pacing between the tight focus and then the bigger picture. However, if you've got players who don't enjoy these larger battles, then it can be a significant impediment towards the game that you're playing at hand. So you've got to be careful how you work those with the groups that you're playing with. On the other side, this is the truly crazy attack on a Tyranid Hive ship that we played once. Effectively, the big map there is nothing more than a map for the players to wander around. And because it's 40k, they've got a complete scan of the areas they're going into. So it doesn't really matter if they've got all the information beforehand. The actual mini game is down in the corner. If I pull out my mouse here, that's actually the mini game. This bit here is a completely separate team that are moving into a different part of the Hive ship. And watching that team progressing forwards with its own small set of mechanics added tension to the primary game that was going on elsewhere, because their successes immediately impacted the successes of the main game itself. So we had a mini game running, which was adding to the narrative and wasn't just a simple, I make it up as we go along, as GMs are sometimes want to do. There was a set of rules that were going on, and the players themselves were making decisions as to exactly what sort of messages were getting passed over, what sort of intelligence was being passed. And that significantly changed the adventure at hand, where they were wandering around on a map, much like you'd normally expect. Right, kicking over to our other ones we have. Here is Lindsay from a bajillion years ago testing out a mini game for a wizard dueling battle system. Again, this was a mini game that we played in between sessions because it could have a significant impact on the actual sessions themselves. But everything that happened on the in-between session stuff impacted the actual role-playing sessions. We had a complete game for this. And I think that others may mention that. The other one is just what used to be done before we had virtual tabletops. Oh, back in the day.
The Hall of Jules one is an interesting one because in the first time we played that, I don't think we maybe had one character in the very minor parts of the Hall of Jules, but none of our characters were in serious contention to be the next supreme patriarch or matriarch of the 8 colleges of magic. And that's what I was talking about, where it would replace like storytelling, or it would replace the GM just making a few rolls and deciding with it, with us being able to take on different characters and have the agency. And, you know, like we talked about it ourselves, didn't we, Andy? We like took on people and went against each other, or you and I took people on and went against Andy Law if it was a particular NPC. But he was like, no, I'm going to take this one. And we were like, oh, that probably means they're cheating.
What was particularly nice about it as well was you had the mini game that was the Hall of Jules, but then you had a mini game around the Hall of Jules, which was betting on the Hall of Jules. So there was like it was like Inception with kind of layers of mini games. But it was good because it did, as you say, it drove on the narrative, not necessarily our character's personal narrative, but the wider narrative of the world. But it also made our characters feel connected to that. Yeah. And as players, we were also having a lot of fun. And
the betting game was great because we had access to kind of the publicly known stats of the characters, and some of those were fake, but you could find that out by gossip or by, you know, making friends with a Jade Magister or Jade Wizard and having a drink with them or whatever. And actually, I think that led a couple of us to make massive gains in the first round on betting on a complete outsider. Which, of course, the next round, like, you couldn't.
I'll now go on to a completely different idea. This is on the big scale. This is when you decide that you have yourself an entire massive battle with hundreds of Space Marines facing off against each other in a whole host of tunnels underneath Calth. And you don't want to just simply play through the players going through by room through what could be dull conflict. You want to play days at a time with small snapshots of roleplay. Rather than necessarily just narrating it all, you can play the big game in the background to fuel the RPG that's going on at the table. That's exactly what this one was. And to playtest this one, we took the character who was a seer, and they got to playtest the rules because they got an idea of how everything worked because they could see the future. So they saw how all the rules worked and where the most likely things could possibly go wrong through the course of the playing through the game. And then when we actually played it themselves, they didn't realize there was a big massive block in the warp and Tyranids were coming. So their playtesting was useful up to turn 5, then it all went wrong. But that's an example of far bigger mini games, which are less a mini game and more an alternative to resolving a particular situation. So their playtesting was useful up to turn 5, then it all went wrong. Am I hearing myself there?
Yes, you are.
Oh, that's weird.
Are you getting volume from Twitch or YouTube, Andy?
I've got everything switched off at this end, so I don't think it's me. It's vanished. The last one is just the classic. I'm playing a role-playing game, and most of my role-playing game rules are designed around only dealing with a small conflict of about at maximum 10 to 15 characters. What if you have a gigantic one? Sometimes actually playing it out as a mini game works better, so you have a faster resolution for combat or a faster resolution for magic or anything similar, and you just slam it out on the table with some quick bits of paper, as I did in this particular instance, grabbing a whole pile of miniatures. So there's a bunch of examples I've done. I have done far more than that. These are the bigger ones because these are the ones I have photographs of. Most of the smaller ones you don't have photographs because they're things that happen at the table. We can now get rid of that.
Yay! Excellent. So we've got a question. What about integrating mini games into the artwork or cartography in similar vein to Game of Life, but with more player agency?
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Does that mean like making an actual like a board game artifact in your RPG? So there's like a pull-out map that's actually a board game board. I think is what they're suggesting.
Possibly.
Oh, right. And so you kind of like traverse through the world through the board game like you would in the game of life. And that would be interesting.
That's that's what I'm thinking. And then at certain points, you have a little role-playing session when something interesting comes up.
Yeah,
I would like sorry, Andy, on you go.
Yeah, it depends on the game you're playing. Because some games are actually designed around that concept. And if that's what you're playing, and that's the style of game you're playing, you're often better just playing that game rather than create yourself a little mini game in the background for something else. If you're actually playing a particular setting, though, spot on, wait. If you're playing a particular setting, though, like say, for example, Warhammer or a D&D one or anything similar, you might find that there's a style of game you want to play in that setting that your rules don't quite match. And that's when you start looking out towards other games and saying, can they offer me something that I can pull in? And what do I chop off of those rules to make it fit the campaign that I'm presenting best? And then when it starts becoming almost a new rule set on the edge for dealing with whatever else, it's then its own proper mini game rather than just a port of someone else's rules.
So some of the chat that was on Discord earlier in the week was about what mini games weren't. So things like the GM just doesn't really fancy creating something for the evening, so you end up in a bar and there's a game of poker, like not really a mini game. And that person was making the point, like if I wanted to play poker, I would go to a poker game. I wouldn't go role playing, so I could go and play poker.
Yeah, but I was thinking about exactly this because generally speaking, I kind of agree with that sentiment. I'm much more interested in what I call the kind of the integrated ones rather than incidental. But there is something there, right? So if we take that, it doesn't need to be poker. It could be an artificial game, and probably you'd want to play something that was quicker than poker, so you could actually get through it and get onto something else. But if you spent a bit of time actually playing a game against an NPC, so you get to know that NPC, you're maybe actually trying to read their tells, they're trying to read yours, and either you win big or they win big, or you cheat or they cheat, and something happens that doesn't necessarily result in either character dying. What you've established there is a relationship that then becomes something in future encounters. So, for instance, not at all basing this on something that happened to us in the Enemy Within campaign, but let's imagine that you had a situation like that and you played a game against a certain, heavily accented gambler, and then the next day found yourself in the coach with said person. And you had cheated in that game and they had cheated in that game, and both of you knew that and had acknowledged that, but the other players didn't know. That then led to quite an interestingly tense conversation while my character and this NPC sort of sussed each other out in terms of, was one or the other going to throw the other one kind of under the coach, so to speak, in terms of what had happened the night before. And all of that happened because we spent not long, but like maybe 10, 15 minutes in the session actually playing a bit of a game, having a bit of banter as we kind of played. So I think, like, as with anything, it's if there is payoff from it, I think like a good analogy, like very briefly, is in TV shows, people often complain about filler episodes where it doesn't progress the plot. And I think like if the episode is just a random, you're spinning your wheels and it has no impact or significance later, then yeah, sure, that's a filler. But sometimes the little standalone character-based episode is actually going to pay off later. I think a really good example of that, without spoiling anything, is the TV show Mythic Quest, which is about a computer game, has an entirely standalone episode in the middle of the first season that doesn't have any characters in common with anyone else, and it's set kind of before the rest of the show. And it doesn't have a payoff in terms of plot, but it absolutely has a payoff in terms of character and thematic resonance later that means it's entirely earned. And I think the same is true in RPGs. If you're going to pay it off somewhere, then it's not a diversion, it's not a waste of time. So
I have one comment to quickly add on top of that, and that's immersion. It can make a scene more immersive. There's something to be said about sitting down and gambling with 2 or 3 others, where your character is enjoying the banter and getting stuck in. There's something quite different in that particular scene if you are actually holding cards, if you're looking at the other players, if there is only one NPC and maybe 2 or 3 other players doing it as well, and you're looking to try and, for example, get information out of one of those NPCs. If it's a scene that has a point. If there is something that is doing towards, as Andy said, the next scene, or if it's the scene itself which is extracting information, then that mini game inside doesn't just immerse the players inside the setting a bit more deeply because they're playing something that's possibly about the setting. If the mini game has been cleverly designed, it's also telling you something about the setting too. The very game itself may be designed around a historical fact that happened in that setting. So through the very nature of playing the game, you're learning about the setting too. Again, that's all about how the GMs individually present it. But from our side as creatives, if we're ever adding little mini games into a standard setting, which is something that we as the Rookery can do very easily, because our products are designed for all role-playing games, which means that we're always looking at these things and saying, can we add something to this that their individual games certainly won't offer? And we can generally say, yeah, sure. And we can then not just craft a fun little mini game so that you've got a mechanic or something similar that you can deploy if you should ever encounter a similar situation in the future, but we can create one that's particularly thematic and also speaks to the tale being told as we are moving forward with whatever the supplement is at hand.
So there's a question here, and you've started to touch on the answer, but we can go into it more depth. So hi there, and thank you all. Why, thank you. How and when do you get the idea for a minigame? Do you have the idea at the beginning to build the minigame into the scene from the start? We often use a clock in the game to build tension, and we could maybe do a lot more with a minigame.
Anyone want to jump in? Because I can. I do this quite a bit. I tend to find that in my case, the first question is, how long is the campaign going to be? Because if it's short, then your mini games, you almost certainly don't want to be big. You want them to be small, if they're there at all. And the second one is there any particular part of the story that your rules can't cover or don't cover very well? And if the answer is yes, there is something coming up that my rules don't cover, then you can look at it as potentially a mini game or potentially presenting it in a different way. The most common one is exactly what you suggest there, which is building tension. You can do things that TV shows do frequently that role-playing games very poorly tackle, and that is you can provide information to the players that the characters don't have. So, for example, if you're dealing with a very simple mini game in the background, let's say it's something on a chessboard, just to give an idea of how two forces are taking to a battle, and you've got a very simple set of rules that the players themselves can interact with if they want to. So their own failures can then impact what's happening as the player characters are dealing with the outcome of what's going on. The player characters have no idea how the battle's going, but the players do, and they can see it going wrong, and that increases the tension at the table in a fashion that just simply wouldn't happen if you were just giving narrative. The narrative often feels like it's wibbly wobbly sometimes, and you can see quite literally the issues in front of you as a quick little mini game, another map, a clock ticking down or similar. So yes, it can be used to build tension, for example, but for me, my first step is generally, if there's something missing, I would like to add it.
Yeah, that's how I feel as well. I always see mini games as a solution to a problem, which is perhaps a little limited, but that's how I've always done it in the past. If it's a problem like the conventional rules would just take too long and too many dice rolls to resolve this situation, or even if it's something like, well, here we are, or we're sitting in a tavern for the umpteenth time with nothing particular to do until something happens. But yeah, if a mini game solves a problem, that's what prompts me. That's what gets me thinking.
And then the next question. What about reversing the idea to use actual poker to represent a normally dice-heavy aspect of the mechanics like combat? Now, we haven't used poker in particular to do that, but you have experimented, and we have experimented with different ways of resolving things in minigames.
With resolving things. Yeah, absolutely. I think loosely taking that and exploding out a little bit, it's simplifying a particular set of mechanics. And is it worth doing? And the answer is generally yes. I gave a quick picture of a large number of combatants in a very small area. If you try to play that with most rule sets, it quickly bogs down to a 3 or 4 hour confrontation. And if you're looking for this to be almost a speed bump in terms of the overall story, that's a problem. The very story that's being told, or the narrative's being told, is being inhibited by the combat rules that stand before you. Now, if you're playing a game that is quite strategic and it's all about where do my characters go and how well have I done, what spells do I unleash, then play that out. Your rules are more than capable of handling everything. But if you're doing a more narrative story, then absolutely finding an alternative to doing it, setting those rules down and ensuring that your players understand them is well worth it. And it can be as simple as, I'll randomize it with a die, I'll randomize it with a set of cards. This might be just a single simple roll, but as long as everybody understands what this roll represents, you're moving into a small mini game at the side that's outside of the standard mechanics of the rules at hand.
Another good example of where you would simplify something or rationalize something is like the example of the Hall of Jewels minigame, where obviously there's wizards from all the colleges, they all have different spells, but it was simplified down for the purposes of that game to be a blast spell, a tangle spell, a freeze spell, and whatever college you were from, that's got the narrative color, but essentially the mechanics for the purposes of the Hall of Jewels did the same thing. It stopped you moving, it hurt you, it shielded you, it blocked you.
Absolutely. And that entire thing was set up so that we could have big, massive wizard duels without having to go through all the rigmarole of rules that frankly weren't designed for wizard duels. They were often designed for PCs to blast out something without any real awareness of how dispels could go, how the pool and tug of magic could actually flow on a duelist level. And if you tried to use what was then the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay rules for it, or indeed the third or the fourth, it makes for a poor duel. It tends to be whoever gets their spell off first, and the other side's in trouble. And that just wasn't fun. It was the opposite of fun.
Or just nobody gets a spell off.
Yeah,
and you just stand there yelling magic at each other, but nothing happens. So.
With other rule sets, that was often the case as well. I tend to find that most of the best duelist rules were often board games, where they were trying to build a fun board game where it was tense as to who was going to win at the end, rather than the roleplay set of rules, which tend to focus on individual spells, their individual capabilities, and turn about in such a fashion that it happened to be whoever got the first turn often had an enormous advantage. And it was often deadly to the extreme that was not very useful for determining a wizard duel because, oops, I've killed him. That's an awful lot of deserts in this town. Oops, that wasn't the intent. It was meant to be duels with outcomes that didn't involve death.
It's interesting. All that talk about duels has just made me realize something. I'm late to the party, I know, but I'm currently playing Ghost of Tsushima, the sort of samurai kind of action RPG video game. And the standoff scenes that you have are essentially a mini game. Yes, because they're combat, but they're done differently. Yes. And the reason it works so effectively, obviously, for anyone who hasn't played it, is it's not trying to be authentic Japanese history. It's very much playing into the samurai movies and kind of Kurosawa, and it absolutely captures that feel, that cinematic scope of it through using a different mechanic. So I guess there's something there as well in terms of the tone of what you're playing.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to why playing the correct roleplay game for the setting at hand is deemed to be by many to be very important, because they will nail the theme.
Yeah, and why us potentially adding mini games into our kind of system agnostic stuff is so appropriate if we're trying to create a particular tone.
Absolutely. Warhammer or D&D or whichever game you might be playing is great at playing often those systems, but not very good at nailing down a tone. D&D, for all it can play a great horror game, doesn't play horror as well as a system that's designed around horror. And your choices, if you're playing D&D purely as your game of choice, is, well, do I add in some extra rules or do I just make do with what I've got? And adding in those little subsystems, which might just be roles used in a different way, which might be a completely different set of, not necessarily stats, but a system for, say, a reputation. How well am I received when I moved to village number 2 in comparison to what I did back when I was in village number 1? We're then adding in a new mechanic for how well reputation is set. There's a host of rules attached to it. The PCs understand it. The players understand it. And thus, we've got ourselves a small game running at the side of the core rule set. And that's the beginning of a mini game that you're beginning to add to your particular set of rules. And if you're playing a game where the opinion of others is super important for the overall story you're telling, then you want that as a mechanic. Of course, though, if you're playing a game all about vampires, D&D is probably not your best bet for the starting rule set. Maybe Vampire is. It's all about picking and choosing the best bits for what you're doing.
Here's a suggestion for a minigame. Hungry halflings, the pie-eating minigame.
Yeah,
I like it.
lovely.
I mean, if you can get ones that use the kind of flowers I'm not intolerant to, we could try that one in real life. Actual pie eating.
Imagine the horror and shame of being born a halfling with a gluten intolerance.
That's it. It'd be terrible. It occurred to me, Andy, as you were talking there about the reputation stuff, because I was just thinking in my head of examples of that I've liked, and I was thinking back to the often maligned third edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and like, you know, the party tension meter,
Yep.
and that, which I think is really good. And then I was thinking about the stances, and it kind of occurred to me that both the strength and weakness of the Wifert 3 rules is that they are essentially a collection of mini games.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
I can only agree with that. I mean, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Third's great strength was that it managed to model certain aspects of playing in the Warhammer world significantly better than the other editions did. Party tension was a really good one, for example.
Yeah.
And there was all manner of good rules in there, but it was a different game.
Yeah.
It just didn't look like a role-playing game, even though it played like
very board game.
Yeah.
And the extra rules that it added, for example, using cards to represent all of your weapons or using cards to represent your spells, weren't seen through to the natural end, which meant you didn't have cards for everything you needed. Meaning that they didn't commit quite far enough to make the whole thing work. Where Star Wars, which followed in afterwards, used the rules in a far more, I think, clean fashion. And its mini games worked really rather well in terms of the light and dark force that sat in the middle, which would have made an absolutely wonderful rule to move into Warhammer with its Save Fate and Fortune, which is effectively the same mechanic. And I would argue that it does it better, and some games have picked up on that and run with it. But again, you're right. They are all, loosely speaking, collections of mini games, and some targeted role-playing games are almost exactly that. They strip out everything that's not needed, and they just focus on a few key points and then just rely on the narrative to string through on those small rule sets. And that is brilliant for the table. But again, you might reach yourself a point where the game that you're playing, if it's lasting for more than, say, 6 sessions, and the rules aren't really designed to be played long term, you then start saying, I want to stick with this and run it for longer. Do I need to add anything on top?
Yeah, it's it doesn't really support homebrew as well as other more open-ended things do. And another point you made, Andy, I found interesting. The line between house rules and mini games is really quite a more permeable one than we might have thought. That thought came to me while you were talking. So what would you say is the difference?
A house rule tends to just be an adaptation of the rule at hand. So, for example, let's keep it really simple. I get +1 according to the rule set. I've looked at that, and I don't think that's effective. It should be +2. That's a very clean house rule. An alternative to a very clean house rule would be, I've looked at the magic rules and I simply don't like them, so I'm going to port in a set of rules from something else and add them on. Now, that's a complete porting of rules. Is it its own game within a game? Not really. It is, however, a set of rules you're going to understand.
Ooh.
Andy's frozen.
And so has Lindsay. It looks like
Miss
Tower's Wi-Fi might have gone down.
It might have done.
Well, Vamp probably wait. Vamp.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the facile answer to what you asked there, Graham, is it the stamp of officialdom? But yeah.
Oh, they're back.
Hello, you're back.
Yeah.
I vanished. That was strange. Everything spun into spiraling circles. I'm sure I was ending on a point there, but I've no idea where it was because I've lost my train of thought. If you add in something new, it's definitely reaching the point of being a mini game, but only if it's a complete separate rule set that's almost separate from the rules, I would say. If it's just integrated into
mechanics.
Yeah, if it's integrated into the rules at hand and it's your streamlining of the rules at hand, that's very much in the realms of house rules. If you are adding an entire barge mechanic for trading up and down a right or a river of some sort, you're now moving into a minigame territory.
Gotcha.
We haven't really talked about mini games that are like puzzles or logic or solving things. I've got a comment from Martin on Discord saying, I've had similar experiences with puzzles I've tried to integrate into the adventure, be it a simple substitution cipher or logic puzzle, reforming a shape from pieces or other iconic puzzles. Typically one, or if I'm lucky, two players latch onto the task while the remaining players get bored and fractious, leading to an increase in their desire for rolling combat dice. If there are no NPC opponents around, they are just as happy to engage in PvP. That said, this sort of minigame does have a place in the space between sessions. Castle management, item gathering, crafting, resource gathering can all be potentially dull pursuits, focused on only one player at a time, but it would be a shame to lose them. I do love like any sort of gathering and like creating into new stuff.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about base building before, and that is, I think, a good example of essentially a mini game that kind of runs. I mean, arguably the whole and the whole between sessions thing is a form of mini game, but very basic.
Yeah, it is.
But it's a separate thing that you do in between sessions. The puzzle one is interesting because I think it hits on one of the perennial problems of role playing games, which is the question of intelligence. Which is, if you have an intelligence stat, but your character being played by a human being who is intelligent, generally more intelligent than their character, unless their character is somehow super intelligent. And you do have that problem of, the foolish barbarian with a very low intelligence happens to be played by somebody who's very good at problem solving, and they fix all the problems immediately.
And that's why I think that for me, I was going to say exactly the same thing. The challenge with puzzles solving and logic is that, to me, it actually kind of takes you out of the immersiveness if the puzzle itself is abstracted. Like, I don't mind solving clues, and Andy Law will know that we go crazy for his clues, often down totally the wrong track.
We don't do it well.
We do not do it well, but we do like it. But they're not like puzzles that he's abstracted for us, and he's like, right, now you're going to solve this jigsaw. Oh, okay.
And
my character's really smart and good at jigsaws, and I'm not.
As always, it would depend on, I've obviously played one character in particular who loved solving puzzles. So that would never feel like it was breaking immersion if he was confronted with an abstract puzzle. But you're right, for most characters it would. Yeah, sorry, Andy, what were you?
Yeah, I got quite a few things to say on this particular one. I'd say from the perspective of us as creators rather than consumers, when it comes to things like puzzles and ensuring that the group can engage with them, it's down to not necessarily the GM and the players to make this work, but for the creator of this puzzle to ensure that it can be engaged with more than just the intelligent character or the player that's particularly interested in that. And I'll give a couple of examples of how that can be done. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, there's a couple of talents that are specifically targeting minigames. There are things like Card Sharp or Dice, I can't remember, the Dice Man, I think it's called, or something similar. And these ones are designed around giving you as a am I still there? Good. Giving you as a player methods of replicating what your character can do that you can't. So, for example, if you're playing a game of poker, just to use a simple thing, and you had Card Sharp, you get an extra card. And then you can do an extra discard, showing that you as a player are more capable, as a character, are more capable than the other characters around the table because you have the necessary skills at hand. And that ensures that player can engage like their character in such a fashion that doesn't feel like the player's intelligence overrides the character's capability. And when it comes to puzzles and building those as a creator, it's exactly the same thing. You can build in particular parts that interact with skills, stats, or similar for the game at hand. So, for example, a character that has a particular stat gets access to certain information. Characters who have low get access to different information. And what you're looking for, particularly as when we're building these things as creators, we're looking for a method of building dialogues at the table where each of the characters has got unique information that they can then bring to the table, which means nobody's left on the outside. Right. Each of those characters is given, for example, a handout, to keep it very simple, that says, A, B, and C, and the next character might have, you know, B, Q, and 2, and the next one might have a different setup, and some of them will be wrong. And that's half of the fun, because then it turns into a real discussion as to how to solve the problem at hand, rather than, oh, well, I know I've got the high stat. We all know that we've passed, that we're all going to listen to that person. We just move on to the next thing. Okay, thanks. Yeah. It's now a matter of the players at the table discussing it out, coming up with their own conclusions, and then trying it out as a group. And then stubborn characters can come to the hand and say, no, I think my way's right. Because they've got a way that they might not necessarily, as players, have come up with. And it gives them an opportunity for role play.
Yeah, that's the thing about puzzles, is so many of them are single player entities, and when you're dealing with a party, that's something to be very aware of.
You just need to play, you know, a cooperative game like Pandemic or something to see that in practice, where you know, it can work really well if everybody's operating at the same wavelength, but it can also be one person plays and tells everybody else what to do in their turn. You don't want it to be that.
No.
I cannot agree with this comment more.
The problem when we play Pandemic is that all of us are that person telling the other person.
No, but that's why it works, right? Because we all chip in. We all think, you know, it's when somebody is quiet and doesn't understand, and if they're not engaged in that process anymore.
And it's our job as creators to ensure to expect that to happen at the table. And to ensure that there is a way for the GM to provide the GM with tools to cope with and combat that. That's perhaps a bit antagonistic, but to deal with it at least, so that there are ways of drawing those characters out. Now, that's not to say that those characters must be drawn into the conversation. Some people don't like engaging anyway. So you've got to make sure that everyone's within their sphere of comfort, but it's to provide tools that can be used if they're needed. As a single example on the minigame side, if you're playing cards, you shouldn't have a setup that is you must play cards. It should be you could play cards, or you could just do a gamble or whatever that is in your system at hand, or you could just say, yeah, we're playing cards, everything's cool. As creators, it's our job to facilitate the sort of style of play that you enjoy. And that puzzles it's often a toughie.
Yeah, and Seago agrees with the level of skill and intelligence on the previous comment, but this one, designing a puzzle to use mechanics and character abilities is the key for RPG puzzles. Absolutely. And I was kind of getting that it's less immersive for me when it does take you, and you're just like, you just have to play cards now. It's more immersive, counterintuitively, if there are mechanics, like Andy said, where like I can't play cards, but my character can, and so I get like a cheat that I wouldn't get in real life. That to me is like in a way more immersive, even though it feels counterintuitively they shouldn't be, because there's a mechanic or an overlay on the mini game that you're playing, but it allows you to engage as a player and have your character there, rather than it just being, well, now it's just you, Lindsay. I think that's good for people who are, you know, less confident in role playing in general.
Yes,
to engage with.
And to Seagoat's current comment, using mechanics and characters' abilities, I think the characters' abilities, because there's such a broad range within a party, it does make puzzles something that seem to be easier to design for a homebrew when you know your party and you know your characters. It's much harder to design in the abstract so that it works for everyone.
Let alone if you're trying to cover any rule set as well. It definitely is complicated.
It's an enjoyable challenge to try out. That much is certain.
It is.
What I think one of the key things we have to remember when we're building these is that we don't just build for the intelligent characters. We don't just build for success. We also build for failure. We build for people who aren't doing very well. We build for people who are arrogant and think they understand a thing when a more practical solution may be the one at hand, one that's built more on craftsman skill than intelligence skills, or whatever it might be. Ensuring that all different character types can engage with whatever it is that's at the center of the particular scene is super, super important, because you've got people who are left on the outside, and you've crafted that as a creator of this scenario. It's your fault. It's not the GM's fault. It's not the player's fault for finding it boring. It's entirely the creator's fault for not considering all the different types of groups that could be there, and ensuring that it may not need a lot, maybe an extra paragraph, but ensuring that those extra skills and details are incorporated.
Yeah, so Smiling Tom says, but can still be left some room for players'
completely.
agency. You can ask them how their character tries to solve the puzzle and choose which skill uses, etc. Yeah,
I think that's the essential part of it, actually. How the players themselves choose to engage with it determines what sort of information they get.
Yeah.
I agree completely. I think Smiling Tom's point, yes. And there is an argument here for passive and active as well. So you've got the active, I'm going to deploy X skill, but passively the character has got high skills elsewhere that you as a GM may decide provides them with extra information. So both, I would argue, is the best place to generally sit when we're building something. And then the individual GMs can then pick out the bits that they find most useful.
It was one of the things that was quite fun, actually, about the Hall of Jewels game, particularly, was when it came to making our PCs in it. Because then there was that little bit of discussion about, like, you know, the nature of, particularly when you're playing a very heavily homebrewed version of Warhammer, as we were at that point, that we all had a number of interesting or odd talents that, you know, or magical artifacts or whatever that might give you a distinct edge. So making that kind of bid to, well, actually, I've got this thing. How would that represent? Would that give me a bonus here? Smiling
Tom had also said on Discord, the clock mechanic from Blades in the Dark is basically system agnostic and a fantastic way to deal with this sort of situation. Lost in a magic maze, tell me what you do to try to get out and which skill you use. Can't repeat an action, but that doesn't mean you can't repeat a skill if you come up with a different application of the skill. And Smiling Tom has used it for chases to good effect too.
Good.
You pinged out for me there, so I didn't hear all of that.
That's how I saw everybody freeze momentarily, but
we're having a fine one this evening, aren't we? Marvelous.
But yeah, it's a very interesting application, and also, just to return to puzzles briefly, a key, particularly if you're designing for everybody, as we would be, make sure there's more than one solution using a completely different skill set, and maybe even three or four, so that there's no blockers, there's no, one character who's vital.
Yeah, so Vagrant says, I have had success in memorable sessions using full-on puzzles, but always with a small group and knowing beforehand it was something both players would engage with. We did leave a mini game for one of our friends once when we had stayed at a hotel and he was having a conference at the hotel the next day, and we left him a treasure hunt.
Nice.
It almost cost him his job. Yeah.
Whatever. Boring.
It's his fault he was tempted by your clues. So it's not your fault. It's not your fault. On that, to take that a little bit further, that's an example of adding a small little set of very simple rules on top of an existing situation. And I think that's something that works very well for our role-playing games as well. People like to play around with and understand simple mechanics, simple rules, where games players generally when we're role-playing anyway. So having a few extra little things to play around with normally works for most people. Doesn't work for all. Everyone knows their own groups better. As creators on our side, we've got to make sure we accommodate everybody's tastes. So we do try to ensure that if we add, say, like a mini game to a situation, we also provide alternatives if you don't want to deal with that. It's super important, actually. So, for example, as a very clean and easy one, in the Enemy Within campaign, there's a famous section that we all mostly have talked about many times where you get a barge. And there's potentially an entire trading mini game that goes on in the background there. Several groups don't deal with that. They just go straight from location 1 to location 2 to location 3, dealing with the primary plot. And that in no way impacts the overall turnout of the story. That's one example of how a minigame can sit outside, but if we're bringing one in that's actually making a difference to the ongoing plot, we've got to make sure that there are alternative methods of presenting that, should a player prefer to just drive through. Yeah, totally. So I have generally found that for our games, that mini games have been mostly successful. My biggest concern is always, does the mini game get in the way of the story or the plot or the game at hand? Does the mini game leave anybody sitting at the side who doesn't want to get involved? And sometimes that will be the case. And if it is, then that was a failure.
next time we reiterate and we try again, we do it differently. And I often find, just in terms of general when to use them, the best places to use them is in longer term campaigns, because what it does is it breaks up the ongoing action. So if you're playing a campaign that's very large, say like the Massive Nyarlathotep, or if you're playing something like a Murder on the Orient Express from one end to the other, you're going to want to have something, if you're playing for, say, 50 to 100 sessions worth of role-playing, having things that break up how that story is presented makes the story more vibrant. It makes the entire process more vibrant. It's much like when we're watching a TV show. If it does the same plot style every single week, it eventually gets boring. The same procedural style again and again. You tend to find that most TV shows, because they've set up such a model, start to jump the shark and try some crazy stuff as they attempt to keep people interested in the show they've got at hand. Far better than doing that. You're better building in natural points where things can be changed and mixed up a little bit, and mini games are one way of dealing with that. A mechanic for what happens when you're ashore at this particular port, or a mechanic for how you deal with a particular set of NPCs in a different way. There's all manner of different ways you can bring these in, but it's down to the game at hand to really nail it down to what sort of game is most appropriate for it.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion on Discord about downtime and using different mechanics in downtime to do things, to gather things, to create things. Runic artifacts was one that was mentioned. Potion making, herb gathering. Some games that weren't role playing games had the reverse, didn't they? I've totally forgotten what game it was, but Warhammer Quest had
flipped,
yeah. So its mini game was role playing rather than the reverse.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Yeah, certainly a lot of people have said that they use them to change up downtime.
Yeah, the downtime mechanics in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 are just an adaptation of Warhammer Quest, and the core traveling system for Warhammer Quest was just adapted to a bunch of events that could happen in downtime during the course of play. So yes, there's nothing wrong with picking and stealing.
Seago asks, is there an easy way to bring in all the players into the minigame? Say the traditional pub game / gambling. What if some of the players and characters are not interested?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to think about who the characters are and who the players are. Like it's impossible to get a one size fits all there. But if I'm sort of thinking of specific examples of like sometimes in our session, our kind of last campaign that we were playing, and there was one character who was maybe a very experienced gamer in terms of board games and things, but maybe less experienced with role playing. And it was all about, like, you could sometimes see that player maybe wasn't as engaged in that kind of stuff, but all it would take would be the right carrot dangled in front of them about why that was of interest to their character, and suddenly they kind of make just that little cognitive leap to, I'm engaged now, and then suddenly they'd be kind of hooked into it. So I guess it's about knowing your players, knowing your party, and trying to ensure that it's a natural situation for them all to kind of be part of it. There's also nothing wrong with just talking to them directly, just being like, look, we're going to be a pub, so we're going to play some pub games for an hour just to kind of establish the atmosphere. So that's all, these are the games that are there. Which ones are you most interested in? And then that kind of, you're talking to them honestly, but you're giving them a bit of choice. So
yeah, it also sort of shades into another subject that we haven't touched on yet, which is when and how to split the party. Because I can see, in your traditional tavern setting, there are some people over on one table playing cards or whatever. Someone else is chatting up the staff, trying to get information, and a lot could be going on simultaneously there. And if it's handled well by a GM who knows the players and can actually handle splitting the party for a little while, it can, make for quite a feeling of quite a deep lot of action going on simultaneously.
I think, Graham, I think the received wisdom, which is often yelled across the room between our group, is never split the party.
It is, and that's the rule. But it's sort of like, Picasso learned to draw before he invented Cubism. When you're a skilled and experienced GM, you can break that rule to good effect on occasion if you do it well.
Yeah, it's usually players screaming at each other because they have wild motivations and drives at that moment.
I suppose if you can get a mini game that doesn't require GM input to run, so the players can kind of play it either against each other or on their own against the system essentially, then what that does do is that does mean if the GM's having to take individual players away to talk to them while they do those gossip things, there is a diversion, there is something there for them to do. And I know that like in our games when that comes up a lot, because we're quite like roll with an E playing kind of troop, we quite happily would just sit and have conversations in character, but not every group is like that. So this might give groups that are perhaps more interested in the mechanics of role play a mechanical thing that they can do while the GM is kind of imparting one-to-one knowledge. So
it might,
And
I've got a couple of things to add to that. In terms of ensuring that your party is engaged, I generally, not always, it depends on the group at hand, as has been discussed, recommend that you find reasons for the players to be involved beforehand. The classic example being, we've got a big ball coming up, but half my players are barbarians. How do they get involved? And the fish out of water aspect of that part of the storytelling is half the fun of it. And when it comes to mini games, exactly the same thing is part of the fun of it. So for example, instead of we're just coming into the pub to play some pub games, which is ultimately a pretty dull setup, it's far more, we've got this NPC which we as a group have to charm. Unfortunately, all of us have to play against them because of reason X, Y, or Z. So suddenly their characters are now a part of the ongoing tale. They're not playing the game just because it's a thing that's happening today. They're playing it because it's a part of the ongoing tale, and their success or failure will play out to the outcomes. So if this NPC is defeated, for example, this NPC gets very huffy, and that's what they have to deal with. So the players might have to try and play to lose. If this NPC is toweringly arrogant, and needs to be beaten down, perhaps all the players have to defeat them, which means that the weaker players have to be picked up by the stronger. And turning it into a party dynamic, turning it into something that everyone is involved with and all have a stake in, means that it's not something that is boring, because now you've got something that you've got to get your teeth into. And equally, to mirror what was said before by, I think it was Andy and possibly Graham as well, my connection went quite weird. Found out what the connection weirdness was. It was Facebook. Evil Facebook was running in the background. Didn't see it. It had 2 videos streaming, and it was just nomming everything at this end. To reinforce what they say, if you do have a split party, it is sometimes very good to have things that the players can deal with that isn't the primary plot that requires the GM. Mini games are particularly good at that, as long as the mini game has a point. And one way of dealing with that is, instead of having, say, for example, I've got 3 players here and 3 players there. So those 3 players, you go and play that mini game, and we'll talk over here. Take those 3 players and get 2 of those players to play NPCs. Give those players some handouts, which they can give to the other player who's playing them. Okay, so the characters who are just having a quick drink in the corner, while one character is doing something else, and the other ones are role-playing completely different characters on your behalf. And allowing that information to come out should a certain thing happen. So, for example, if they are defeated, they provide this piece of information. If they win, they provide this piece of information as part of the ongoing conversation. So that means that you can have not just mini games running in the corner that they're engaging with and that can aid immersion, but you also have an ongoing development of the story, the plots, the interaction between the characters, because the player, may have played one of the NPCs. It creates a natural link to that NPC. They now feel it's theirs to a degree, and it's also a really good way of, if one of your characters dies, because people have already got some natural connections to some of the NPCs that are at the table, they might go, well, could I play that character later, because I really like that character, and we got a nice rapport going on when I have my ass handed to me during this mini game. And that can make for a little bit more fun at the table too. So it's all about, if your party splits, is there tools at hand to fix that? And if your game doesn't have them, mini games can be one method of resolving that. And it doesn't just mean give them a mini game to play with. It means using a mini game that doesn't require the GM to arbitrate and roll over, while you can then incorporate the players into that, perhaps in a slightly different fashion.
And Seagull echoes something similar. Best mini game I've experienced was as a player. Pub game, simple and light mechanics, but every time one of the PCs were around, we as a party got info relating to the future plot. what you were talking about.
I mean,
Right,
in many
I
respects, that's how, just to conclude on one point, that's how gossip and rumors and similar is often handled in many games as well.
Yeah.
You do well, you get some stuff out of it. And it's the simplest of many games that you tend to find that many creators will use. For example, I have 15 pieces of information I want to get out to the players. Here's a whole host of bits of information that you can drop as and when you want during the course of play. And that's almost a mini game that the creator has added on top of the standard mechanics that you're playing with at the table.
Thank you very much. That's almost 8 o'clock. So thanks for joining us tonight. Sorry about the connectivity there and us dropping out a few times.
Facebook.
Yeah.
Next week, we are going to be doing an Ask Us Anything and some news about the future.
Oh yeah, it's exciting. So yeah, next week, bring all your questions, get them ready, drop them into Discord, drop them into any of our social media accounts. The more questions we have, the better. But we do also have a little bit of news that we'd like to share with you all, and that will be next week.
Excellent. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.